So earlier this week, we discussed the transition the Empire made from the clone troopers to the stormtroopers, specifically about how long that took. And I mentioned that a lot of clone troopers would remain on as officers to train stormtroopers, and that they didn't like the stormtroopers. But we haven't talked much about how the feelings went the other way. What did the stormtroopers and the recruited soldiers think of the clone troopers? Well, today let's take a closer look at that. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So, the feelings that these recruited soldiers would have had toward their clone predecessors changed a lot throughout the years. And, well, some of it we do see on screen in The Bad Batch. Some of it's a little bit less obvious, especially when we get into the later years of the clone's service with the Empire, as more and more Imperial soldiers would end up working with clone troopers. So, today, let's just dive into what these soldiers thought of the clones. Now, let's start in the early days. There's a few obvious exceptions to all of these rules, by the way, so I know no group here is a monolith. Everyone's got different feelings. But let's start with what the regular TK soldiers would have thought being trained by clone commandos. Now, some of this is speculation too, so bear with me. But it does appear like a lot of these TK soldiers very much respected the clone commandos. They were very effective combat units that saw tons of combat during a massive galactic war. So, as a soldier going to be trained for combat, I can't think of a better source of expertise than a commando that had seen extensive combat during the war. And I think some of that did come across in the elements of the TK program, the individual soldiers training underneath these clone troopers. I don't necessarily think that carried for all of them, and we definitely see TK troopers who seem to have active disdain for the clone troopers, but the TK troopers, very key distinction, I'm not talking about the officers here, I'm talking about the TK troopers, likely did have a lot of respect for the clones, and maybe even saw them as fellow soldiers, at least at the start of their training. Now, once again, when they get into service, that might shift a little bit, especially when you see clones go from your training instructor, for whom you have a lot of respect, to the backwater soldiers that work behind the scenes to just kind of keep the back of the line secure, and maybe that sort of mental image garners less respect. Now, this did not hold true for the officer corps, many of whom saw the clone troopers as antiquated and outdated. We see this pretty clearly in The Bad Batch, that even early Imperial officers who maybe even served alongside the clones during the Clone Wars actively disdain the clone troopers. They distrust and dislike them, whether it's for practical reasons or simply the belief that they're not the future. This might not have been as common as it appears in the show, but it definitely was present and definitely was a challenge that the clone troopers did face in those early years. But as time went on, unfortunately, it seems that that disdain became a more common viewpoint. That while the clone troopers had more experience than nearly any Imperial officer could have in combat, after all, once again, the clone troopers fought a major war. Most Imperial officers didn't. As time went on, many Imperial soldiers and officers would come to disdain the clones, and the clones definitely came to dislike the recruited soldiers that replaced them. And as such, that animosity between the two sides grew and became more and more mutual as time went on. By the time of the Battle of Yavin, when only a handful of clones remained in training positions, it's likely that the dislike that those clones had for the soldiers that they were training was probably a two-way street. I'm sure many of those stormtroopers at that point viewed the clone troopers as ancient technology from a war long ago that weren't really relevant anymore, and likely didn't respect them or even honor the training they were given, which might be one of the reasons why later stormtroopers seemed to be so ineffective in combat. Yet, still, the two sides had to work alongside one another, with the clone troopers having to train the stormtroopers, which is a pretty common theme throughout Imperial history. And we can see the direct result of their disdain both in training scenarios and in real-world military situations. Like, for example, what we see at the outpost in The Bad Batch, where an Imperial officer actively puts the clones in harm's way in an effort to simply remove them from the equation. It's also kind of interesting to note that when the Empire needed a hostile force swept out of the way for Imperial troops to go in and take control of it, they did call on clone troopers and not TK troopers to fight that battle, which does kind of show that higher up, maybe Imperial leadership did understand that the clone troopers were, at least at that point in history, a more effective fighting force than the TK troopers they were adopting. That being said, the clone troopers did eventually age out, as is inevitable, especially when you're dealing with an army that has accelerated aging, which obviously played a role in the clone troopers' retirement. If you'd like to learn about how long it took the Empire to replace the clone troopers with recruited soldiers, I'll leave a link up here to a video I put out earlier this week breaking down the timeline for the actual replacement of the clone troopers within the Imperial military from the end of the Clone Wars all the way through to the Battle of Yavin. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think it makes sense for the Stormtroopers to really have disdain for the clone troopers that came before them. Obviously, is it reasonable for them to think that the clone troopers are outdated, or do you think that's misguided and sort of led by Imperial propaganda, which did sort of demonize the clone troopers for quite some time? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars or anywhere else in science fiction, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.